Nobody in that stadium saw it coming. Not the 80,000 fans screaming at the top of their lungs. Not the production crew running cables and shouting into headsets. Not even the man standing at center stage, bathed in a column of white light so blinding it looked like he'd been sent down from somewhere else entirely. It was the summer of 1994, and Michael Jackson was deep into the Dangerous World Tour. The most ambitious, most expensive, most emotionally grueling tour of his life. And on this particular night, in the roaring electric madness of a packed stadium in New York City, something was about to happen that no set list, no production meeting, and no amount of careful planning could have ever predicted. If you've ever felt the weight of the world watching you, waiting for you to either rise or fall, then you already understand what Whitney Houston was feeling that night, sitting in that VIP section. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell, because the stories we tell here are the ones they never put in the history books. Whitney had come to watch, that was all. She wasn't there to perform. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there because Michael had personally called her 2 days before the show, told her he had a seat with her name on it, and said, in that quiet, earnest way of his that made everything sound like a prayer, "Just come. I need a friendly face in the crowd." Whitney understood that request on a cellular level. In 1994, she and Michael were the two most watched, most scrutinized, most relentlessly pressure-tested artists on the planet. Both of them were carrying weights that most human beings couldn't even comprehend. Michael had just come through the most savage media storm of his career. Whitney was navigating the brutal expectations that followed the worldwide explosion of The Bodyguard, a film and a soundtrack that had made her the best-selling female artist in history, but had also placed her on a pedestal so impossibly high that every single breath she took was now a potential fall. She sat in that VIP section wearing a simple black outfit. No sparkle, no stage presence cranked up. Just Whitney, tired, beautiful, real. She'd tucked herself slightly behind the row in front of her, the way famous people do when they're trying to remember what it feels like to just be a person in a crowd. The people nearest to her had recognized her. You couldn't not. But her body language made it plain. Tonight she was not available to be the icon. She was just a woman who loved music, sitting quietly in the dark, letting someone else carry the spotlight. Until she wasn't. Around her, the noise was volcanic. Michael was performing Thriller, and the stadium was in full delirium. 80,000 people moving and screaming as one single organism surrendered completely to the music. And that's when it happened. Between songs, during that electric breath of silence that falls over a stadium crowd when the last note dies and nobody quite knows what's coming next, Michael walked slowly to the edge of the stage. The lights dimmed just slightly. His security earpiece crackled. He raised one gloved hand to shield his eyes from the spotlight, scanning the crowd with that curious, childlike focus that was uniquely his. People in the front rows were already losing their minds just being looked at by him. But Michael wasn't looking at the front rows. He was looking further back. He was looking for something specific. He found it. The moment his gaze landed on the VIP section, something shifted in his expression. The showman face, that precise, controlled, superhuman performance mask, cracked open just slightly, and what came through was something warmer, something private, something that had no business being seen by 80,000 strangers. A smile, not the performance smile, the real one. He leaned into the microphone and his voice dropped down to almost a whisper, which somehow, in the way of great sound systems and great silences, carried to every corner of that enormous place. "I see somebody out there tonight," he said, "who I think you all might know." The crowd went quiet in that confused, anticipatory way, not sure whether to scream or hold their breath. "Whitney," Michael said simply. Just the one word, but the way he said it, the way he let it hang in the air, like it was both an invitation and a tribute. What happened in the next 30 seconds was something that people who were there that night have spent 30 years trying to describe to people who weren't. 80,000 heads turned, 80,000 necks craned. The camera operators, trained to follow chaos, swung their lenses toward the VIP section. The Jumbotron screens that flanked the stage, each one roughly the size of a small apartment building, blinked and cut to a new image. And there was Whitney Houston, caught completely off guard, laughing in that full-body way she had, her hand flying up to cover her mouth, her eyes going wide with the delighted horror of someone who has just realized there is absolutely no escape. But here is the thing about Whitney Houston, that even her fiercest critics, and she had many, especially in 1994, when the music press had decided that dissecting her was a competitive sport, could never take away from her. Whitney Houston did not know how to be small. She could try to disappear. She could sit in the back row. She could wear plain black and pull her chair behind someone else's. But the moment attention found her, something ancient and unstoppable woke up inside her, and the smallness fell away like a coat she'd only been borrowing. She stood up. The crowd erupted. She started moving toward the stage. And the roar that followed her was the kind of sound that you feel in your sternum before you hear it with your ears. Security guards materialized on either side of her, not to stop her, but to part the sea so she could move. Michael, still at the front of the stage, was grinning now. The full, uncomplicated, ear-to-ear grin of a man watching his plan work exactly as intended. Because make no mistake, that call 2 days before, that one seat with her name on it, that pause between songs and that slow scan of the crowd, this was not an accident. This was Michael Jackson, who understood stagecraft the way other people understand breathing, setting up the single most unscripted, spontaneous, real moment he knew how to create by engineering every condition that would allow it to happen naturally. A stagehand met Whitney at the steps and handed her a microphone. She took it with one hand and grabbed the railing with the other, and as she climbed those 4 steps up to the stage, something in her posture changed completely. The woman who had been trying to be invisible 10 minutes ago was gone. What walked out into that spotlight was something else entirely. Not a performance, not a character. Something rawer than that. Something that had been doing this since she was a girl singing in her mother Sissy's church in Newark, New Jersey, when the music wasn't about the cameras or the contracts or the magazine covers or the album sales figures, but about something so much bigger and so much older than all of that. The crowd was making so much noise that it was almost physical, a wall of sound and heat and wanting. And in the middle of all of it, Whitney Houston stood next to Michael Jackson and looked out at 80,000 people. And for just one moment, one fraction of a second that the cameras caught and that people have freeze-framed and studied ever since, her expression was completely unguarded, not performing, not managing, just feeling it. All of it. The size of the room, the weight of her own name, the strange, bittersweet miracle of being exactly that famous and that talented and that exhausted and that alive all at the same moment. Michael leaned over and said something into her ear. Nobody has ever confirmed exactly what it was, but people close to both of them have suggested, over the years, that it was something simple. Something like, just sing. That's all you ever have to do. She closed her eyes, and then she opened her mouth. What came out of Whitney Houston that night, unplanned, unrehearsed, with no key selected in advance, no monitor mix adjusted for her voice, no choreography, no costume, was the thing that separated her from every other singer who had ever lived. It wasn't technique, although her technique was flawless. It wasn't range, although her range was supernatural. It was the sound of a human soul refusing to be contained by anything as small as a human body. It was gospel and pop, and R&B and raw grief and pure joy, all happening at the same time, in the same breath, from the same place somewhere deep in her chest where all of it lived together without contradiction. The 80,000 people who had been screaming moments before went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience settling down for a ballad. The stunned, involuntary silence of people who have just encountered something they did not know existed and cannot process fast enough to react to. Stage crew members stopped moving. A sound engineer took off his headphones because he didn't need them anymore. The voice was filling the room all by itself. Michael Jackson, the man who had made every person in that stadium lose their minds not 10 minutes earlier, stood slightly behind Whitney and to her right, and watched her with an expression that people who knew him well said they had almost never seen on his face in public. Pure, uncomplicated awe. Because Michael knew. He knew better than anyone in that building what it cost to do what Whitney was doing right now. He knew what it felt like to carry that voice, that gift, that impossible expectation everywhere you went. Every day, every room, every conversation, knowing that people were always waiting for you to prove it or fail to. He knew the loneliness inside the spotlight. He knew the way fame could make you feel like the most seen and the most invisible person on earth simultaneously. He knew all of it, and he had called her. He had put her in that seat. He had said her name into the microphone, because he knew that sometimes the only thing that can silence the noise inside you is the permission to make a different kind of noise, the real kind, the free kind, in front of the people who need to hear it most. When Whitney finished, the silence held for one full second longer than silence usually does in a stadium. That extra second is the truest measure of greatness. It's the involuntary pause that happens when a crowd of 80,000 people all need a moment to remember how to breathe. Then the noise came back, and it was unlike anything that stadium had heard all night. Michael wrapped one arm around her shoulders. She was laughing again and crying at the same time, which is a thing that only happens when something is exactly as real as it should be. He leaned in close and said something else that nobody could hear. She nodded. The two of them stood there together for a moment in the middle of all that noise. Two people who had given more of themselves to the world than the world had any right to ask for, holding each other up in the way that only people who truly understand each other's burden can. Nobody planned that night. Nobody wrote it into a contract or blocked it out in a production schedule or workshopped it in a creative meeting. It happened because Michael Jackson looked out into a crowd of 80,000 people, found the one face he was looking for, and said a name. And because Whitney Houston, tired and real and carrying everything she always carried, stood up anyway. That is what greatness actually looks like. Not the rehearsed version, not the polished, lit, choreographed version. The version that happens when the plan falls away and all that's left is the voice, the gift, and the absolute refusal to be anything less than exactly what you are. The recording from that night, shaky handheld footage, bad audio, the kind of thing that should by all logic sound terrible, has been watched tens of millions of times, because the thing it captured cannot be produced. It can only be witnessed. And some voices, once they decide to open up fully, without warning, without anything to hide behind, simply stop time. Whitney Houston's voice was always that kind of voice. And that night in 1994, standing in a borrowed spotlight on someone else's stage, she reminded every single person in that building exactly why.